Welcome, fellow traveler of infinite dimensions, to the complete chronicle of the Citadel of Rix, the most ambitious and ultimately tragic experiment in Rick civilization across the multiverse. Tonight, we explore the rise and fall of a society built by the smartest beings in existence, only to become a monument to their greatest flaws. Settle in comfortably and let your mind drift as we journey through this pocket dimension where infinite Ricks attempted to create order from chaos, unity from solitude, and meaning from their shared burden of cosmic intelligence. There's no need to remember every detail. Simply let this story of genius, hubris, and inevitable corruption wash over you like portal fluid through interdimensional space, carrying you toward peaceful rest. The fundamental problem of being Rick Sanchez extends far beyond the simple contradiction of claiming to be the smartest person in a multiverse that contains infinite versions of yourself making identical claims. The true complexity emerges when you consider that each Rick's extraordinary intelligence creates ripple effects that cascade across dimensional boundaries, affecting countless other Ricks who had no involvement in the original decisions but must live with the consequences nonetheless. This interconnectedness of multiversal genius creates a web of responsibility and consequence that most Ricks are philosophically unprepared to acknowledge, let alone address through collective action. Rick C-137's approach to this fundamental problem has always been rooted in a philosophy of radical individualism that treats multiversal consequences as someone else's problem. When he destroyed his original dimension through the love potion catastrophe, transforming the entire human population into grotesque monsters before abandoning them to find a replacement reality, he demonstrated the casual attitude toward consequences that characterizes his approach to problem solving. The fact that countless other dimensions contain populations dealing with similar Rick-created disasters was irrelevant to his immediate need for a comfortable place to continue his existence with minimal inconvenience. But this individualistic approach to multiversal existence creates compounding problems that no single Rick can solve through superior intelligence or technological innovation. Every time a Rick develops a new weapon, creates a new form of dangerous technology, or attracts the attention of powerful enemies, the resulting conflicts spill over into adjacent realities where other Ricks must deal with threats they did not create and may not understand. The butterfly effect of Rick-level intelligence operating across infinite dimensions means that even seemingly minor decisions can trigger cascading crises that affect entire civilizations across multiple realities. The specific nature of Rick's genius compounds these problems in ways that ordinary intelligence would not. Rick's inventions are not simple tools that can be easily contained or controlled, but rather fundamental alterations to the structure of reality itself that persist long after their creator has moved on to other projects or abandoned the dimensions where they were deployed. Portal technology, genetic manipulation devices, artificial intelligences, and reality-altering weapons all possess the capacity to evolve and spread beyond their original parameters, creating ongoing sources of multiversal instability that require constant management and oversight. The enemies that Rick attracts through his activities are similarly persistent and far-reaching in their impact on other Ricks across the multiverse. When Rick C-137 antagonizes the Galactic Federation, develops conflicts with interdimensional governments, or creates personal vendettas with cosmic-level threats, the resulting pursuit and retaliation efforts extend to every Rick that Federation agents or other enemies might encounter during their search. Rick's reputation precedes him across dimensions in ways that create immediate danger for any alternate version of himself that law enforcement or hostile forces might mistake for the specific Rick they are hunting. The philosophical implications of these interconnected consequences challenged the fundamental assumptions that most Ricks make about the nature of identity and responsibility in a multiverse where infinite versions of yourself exist simultaneously. Rick C-137's nihilistic worldview treats the existence of alternate versions as proof that individual choices are meaningless, since every possible decision is being made by some Rick somewhere across infinite realities. But this perspective conveniently ignores the reality that the consequences of those choices affect real people in specific dimensions, including other Ricks who share his face and general personality but not his particular history of destructive decisions. The burden of cosmic intelligence that defines Rick's existence across all dimensions includes not just the ability to understand and manipulate fundamental forces of reality, but also the psychological weight of recognizing how limited and flawed most other beings appear when viewed from the perspective of superior analytical capabilities. This isolation from normal social connections and moral frameworks makes it difficult for Ricks to develop the kind of empathetic understanding that might motivate them to consider the broader implications of their actions on beings they perceive as fundamentally inferior. Rick's casual attitude toward dimensional abandonment exemplifies the broader problem of how genius-level intelligence can become disconnected from normal moral considerations about the welfare of populations and civilizations. When Rick determines that a dimension has become inconvenient or dangerous, his solution is typically to find a replacement reality rather than to address the problems he has created or accept responsibility for their resolution. This pattern of escape and substitution works for Rick as an individual but creates ongoing sources of instability and suffering in the dimensions he abandons. The accumulation of Rick-related problems across the central finite curve began to create patterns that even individual Ricks could not ignore indefinitely. Reports of Rick sightings, Rick-related destruction, and Rick-caused multiversal incidents began appearing with sufficient frequency that some Ricks started to recognize the systematic nature of the problems they were all contributing to through their individual pursuit of personal goals without regard for collective consequences. The realization that Rick genius was creating more problems than it solved forced some Ricks to question whether their traditional approach of radical individualism was sustainable in a multiverse, where their actions inevitably affected countless other versions of themselves. The growing awareness among certain Ricks that their individual actions had multiversal implications created the first stirrings of what would eventually become the philosophical foundation for the Citadel project. These Ricks began to argue that their superior intelligence carried with it certain responsibilities that could not be discharged through continued adherence to nihilistic individualism and casual disregard for consequences that affected other Ricks and their associated Mortys, Beths, Jerrys, and Summers across infinite realities. The practical problems created by Rick activities were often immediately visible and undeniably serious in ways that made philosophical debates about responsibility seem like luxuries that could not be afforded while dealing with ongoing crises. Portal technology falling into the wrong hands created multiversal wars. Rick-invented weapons were being reverse-engineered by hostile civilizations, and the enemies that Ricks attracted through their activities were beginning to organize systematic campaigns against all Ricks, regardless of their individual involvement in specific conflicts. Rick C-137's reputation as a particularly dangerous and unpredictable Rick made him a focal point for many of these discussions about collective responsibility and the need for some form of Rick coordination or oversight. Other Ricks recognized that Rick C-137's activities were creating problems that affected all of them, but they also acknowledged that his capabilities and willingness to use extreme methods made him potentially useful for addressing threats that individual Ricks might not be able to handle alone. The paradox of Rick genius, creating both the problems and the potential solutions for multiversal stability, highlighted the fundamental challenge that would eventually lead to the Citadel's formation. Ricks were simultaneously the greatest source of multiversal instability and the only beings with sufficient intelligence and technological capability to address that instability through coordinated action. But coordination required the kind of cooperation and compromise that contradicted everything most Ricks believed about their own superiority and independence. The enemies that Ricks faced as a result of their collective activities were often sophisticated enough to recognize the patterns in Rick behavior and develop strategies that exploited the individualistic approach that prevented Ricks from partas working together effectively. Galactic governments learned to treat all Ricks as equally dangerous, regardless of their individual actions, while interdimensional law enforcement agencies developed protocols for containing Rick-level threats that assumed coordination and mutual support among their targets that simply did not exist. The isolation that Rick's genius imposed on their relationships with other beings extended to their relationships with other Ricks in ways that made collective action particularly difficult to organize and sustain. Each Rick believed that his own approach to problem solving was superior to alternatives that other Ricks might propose, while the competitive dynamics that emerged when multiple Ricks attempted to work together often resulted in conflicts that were more destructive than the original problems they had gathered to address. The recognition that Rick genius was creating an unsustainable trajectory of multiversal instability forced some Ricks to consider whether their traditional assumptions about the value of absolute freedom and individual autonomy might need to be modified in light of the broader implications of their choices for the welfare of beings across infinite realities. These Ricks began to develop arguments for why superior intelligence might carry with it certain obligations to use that intelligence responsibly, even if doing so required accepting limitations on individual freedom that contradicted their natural inclinations toward absolute autonomy. The philosophical and practical problems created by the existence of infinite Ricks across the central finite curve were becoming too systematic and widespread to be addressed through the kind of individual responses that had previously characterized Rick approaches to multiversal challenges. The need for some form of collective response was becoming apparent even to Ricks who were philosophically opposed to cooperation or compromise, as the alternative seemed to involve either accepting ongoing chaos or attempting to eliminate all other Ricks through systematic warfare that would be both practically difficult and ultimately self-defeating. The emergence of the Citadel of Ricks as a concrete possibility rather than abstract philosophical concept began with a small group of Ricks who had grown weary of the constant cycle of multiversal crises that seemed to follow their species across every dimension where they appeared. These founding Ricks were not motivated by altruism or sudden conversion to collective responsibility, but rather by the practical recognition that their individual survival and comfort were becoming increasingly threatened by the chaotic consequences of uncoordinated Rick activities throughout the central finite curve. The Rick, who would later be known as the primary architect of the Citadel project, was himself a refugee from a dimension where Rick-related conflicts had escalated to the point where his home reality had become uninhabitable, even by Rick standards. His experience of losing everything he had built due to conflicts initiated by other Ricks provided him with personal motivation to develop solutions that went beyond the traditional Rick approach of dimensional abandonment and replacement. When problems became too severe to ignore, this founding Rick's initial proposal was elegantly simple in concept, but staggeringly complex in its implications for Rick society and psychology. He argued that Ricks needed a neutral space where they could coordinate their activities, share information about multiversal threats, and develop protocols for minimizing the negative externalities that resulted from their individual pursuit of scientific and personal objectives. The space would need to be completely isolated from any existing dimension to prevent it from becoming a target for Rick enemies, or being affected by the various catastrophes that Ricks regularly created in their home realities. The philosophical debates that preceded the Citadel's construction were intense and prolonged, involving Ricks from dozens of dimensions, who had been contacted through careful use of portal technology to identify versions of Rick Sanchez, who might be receptive to collaborative approaches to multiversal problem-solving. These debates revealed the full spectrum of Rick attitudes toward cooperation, responsibility, and the value of maintaining connections with other beings who shared their intelligence and general psychological patterns. The Rick faction that supported the Citadel project argued that their superior intelligence carried with it certain practical obligations to use that intelligence in ways that maximized beneficial outcomes across the multiverse, rather than simply pursuing individual gratification without regard for broader consequences. They pointed to the escalating pattern of Rick-related conflicts and the growing sophistication of anti-Rick coalitions among various galactic governments as evidence that individualistic approaches to multiversal existence were becoming unsustainable, even for beings of their exceptional capabilities. The opposition faction, which would eventually include philosophical allies of Rick C-137, despite his absence from these early discussions, maintained that the Citadel project represented a fundamental betrayal of everything that made Rick identity meaningful and valuable. They argued that Rick genius was inherently individualistic and could not be channeled through collective institutions without being corrupted and diminished in ways that would ultimately make Ricks less effective at solving the kinds of complex problems that required their unique combination of intelligence, creativity, and willingness to ignore conventional moral and social constraints. The compromise that emerged from these debates reflected both the practical necessities that motivated the Citadel's supporters and the philosophical concerns raised by its critics. The Citadel would be established as a voluntary association of Ricks who chose to participate in coordinated activities, but it would not attempt to exercise authority over Ricks who preferred to maintain their independence. The governance structure would be designed to minimize bureaucracy and administrative overhead, while providing sufficient organization to accomplish collective objectives that individual Ricks could not achieve alone. The selection of the pocket dimension that would house the Citadel required extensive surveying and analysis to identify a location that met the project's unique requirements for security, accessibility, and isolation from existing multiversal conflicts. The chosen dimension was artificially created rather than naturally occurring, constructed through collective Rick effort using portal technology and matter manipulation devices that represented the most advanced applications of their scientific capabilities to date. The construction process itself became the first major test of Rick ability to work together on complex projects that required sustained cooperation and coordination among beings who were psychologically predisposed toward individual autonomy and control. The engineering challenges involved in creating a stable artificial dimension were substantial enough to require genuine collaboration rather than simple parallel work by individual Ricks, forcing the project's participants to develop communication and decision-making protocols that balanced efficiency with respect for individual Rick preferences and working styles. The early infrastructure of the Citadel reflected both the practical needs of its Rick inhabitants and their shared aesthetic preferences for environments that emphasized functionality and technological sophistication over comfort or beauty. The architecture was modular and expandable, designed to accommodate growth. As more RICs chose to participate in Citadel activities while also providing secure spaces for individual work and research that would not be subject to interference from other residents or visitors. The first Council of RICs was established through a selection process that attempted to balance representation of different RIC perspectives and specializations with practical considerations about leadership capability and commitment to the Citadel project's success. The council members were chosen for their demonstrated ability to work with other RICs rather than their individual scientific achievements, reflecting the recognition that governance of RIC society would require political and social skills that were often underdeveloped in beings who had spent most of their lives operating as isolated individuals. The initial policies developed by the First Council addressed the most pressing practical problems that had motivated the Citadel's creation, while establishing precedents for how RIC collective decision-making would function in subsequent years. The Jerry storage facility was among the first major services provided by the Citadel, responding to the widespread RIC complaint that their interdimensional adventures were frequently complicated by the presence of Jerry family members who lacked the intelligence or psychological resilience necessary for safe participation in RIC-level activities. The portal technology protection protocols represented a more complex and controversial area of early Citadel policy, requiring the Council to balance RIC preferences for individual autonomy with collective security concerns about portal technology falling into the hands of hostile governments or organizations that might use it to target RICs across multiple dimensions. The protocols established procedures for monitoring portal technology distribution and responding to security breaches while avoiding direct interference with individual RIC research and development activities. The dimensional monitoring systems that the Citadel established represented perhaps the most ambitious early application of collective RIC resources to problems that exceeded the capabilities of individual RICs working alone. These systems provided early warning about multiversal threats, tracked the movements and activities of known RIC enemies, and maintained databases of information about dimensions that posed particular risks or opportunities for RIC activities and research. The golden age of Citadel operations lasted for several years, during which the benefits of RIC cooperation seemed to outweigh the costs and complications of collective governance. The Citadel's services and resources enabled participating RICs to pursue more ambitious projects while facing fewer security threats and practical obstacles than they had encountered during their previous periods of isolation and independence. The success of early Citadel initiatives created momentum for expanding the scope of collective RIC activities and developing more sophisticated approaches to multiversal coordination. The RIC recruitment efforts that expanded Citadel participation beyond the original founding members were conducted through careful outreach to RICs, who had demonstrated both exceptional capabilities and some degree of willingness to consider alternatives to pure individualism when circumstances required collective responses to shared problems. The recruitment process was designed to identify RICs who could contribute valuable skills and resources while maintaining compatibility with the Citadel's governance structures and operational procedures. The cultural developments that emerged during the Citadel's early period reflected both the shared experiences of RIC life across dimensions and the particular challenges of creating sustainable social institutions among beings who had typically avoided long-term commitments to organizations or communities. The Citadel developed its own traditions, customs, and informal social hierarchies that provided structure for RIC interactions while accommodating their preferences for individual recognition and autonomy within collective frameworks. The technological innovations that resulted from RIC collaboration at the Citadel exceeded what any individual Rick had achieved working alone, demonstrating the potential benefits of pooling Rick intelligence and resources for major research and development projects. These innovations included advances in portal technology, defensive systems, and manufacturing techniques that enhanced the capabilities of all participating Ricks, while also providing the Citadel with resources that could be used to fund expanded operations and services. The success stories from the Citadel's early period provided concrete evidence that Rick cooperation could produce beneficial outcomes that justified the philosophical and practical compromises required for collective governance among beings who preferred individual autonomy. These successes created positive feedback loops that encouraged more Ricks to consider Citadel participation, while also providing Citadel leadership with increased confidence about the viability of their institutional experiment. Rick C-137's absence from these early developments was noted by many participating Ricks, who recognized his reputation for exceptional capabilities and innovative problem-solving approaches. His philosophical opposition to collective institutions was well known among Ricks who followed multiversal politics and scientific developments, but some Citadel supporters hoped that concrete demonstrations of successful Rick cooperation might eventually convince him to reconsider his stance against organized Rick activities. The philosophical tensions that would eventually undermine the Citadel were present from its earliest days, but were initially overshadowed by practical successes and the novelty of Rick cooperation producing beneficial outcomes for all participants. These tensions centered on fundamental questions about the relationship between individual Rick autonomy and collective Rick welfare that could not be resolved through compromise or institutional design, but would require ongoing negotiation and adjustment as circumstances changed. The monitoring systems that the early Citadel established to track Rick C-137's activities reflected both genuine concern about his potential to create problems that would affect other Ricks and growing recognition that his independence from Citadel authority posed challenges for the long-term viability of Rick collective governance. His continued success at solving complex problems through individual action provided alternative models for Rick behavior that competing with Citadel approaches to multiversal challenge management. The seeds of future conflicts between the Citadel and Rick C-137 were planted during this early period through policy decisions and institutional developments that reflected Citadel assumptions about proper Rick behavior and responsibilities that contradicted Rick C-137's fundamental beliefs about individual autonomy and the meaninglessness of collective moral obligations in a multiverse where infinite alternatives made any particular choice essentially arbitrary. The establishment of the Citadel as a functioning Rick society represented both a remarkable achievement in overcoming the psychological and philosophical obstacles to Rick cooperation and the creation of new forms of Rick identity and purpose that would eventually come into conflict with traditional Rick approaches to multiversal existence. The success of the early Citadel demonstrated that Rick genius could be channeled through collective institutions, but it also created expectations and dependencies that would prove difficult to maintain as the Citadel grew in size and complexity, while facing increasingly sophisticated challenges from both internal contradictions and external threats. The transformation of the Citadel from a voluntary association of cooperating Ricks into a complex hierarchical society occurred gradually, driven by the practical necessities of managing an organization that had grown far beyond its original conception and scope. What began as a simple coordination mechanism for addressing shared problems evolved into a comprehensive social system that replicated many of the power structures and class divisions that Ricks had originally sought to escape through, their rejection of conventional authority and social institutions. The emergence of distinct Rick castes within the Citadel was not planned or deliberately designed by the original founders, but arose organically from the different roles and functions that various Ricks assumed as the organization expanded its operations and services. The cool Ricks, who maintained their independence while occasionally utilizing Citadel resources, naturally occupied the top of the social hierarchy, their freedom of movement and action serving as status symbols that distinguished them from Ricks who had become more deeply integrated into Citadel institutional structures. The worker Ricks who staffed the Citadel's various facilities and services found themselves in increasingly subordinate positions, despite possessing the same fundamental intelligence and capabilities as their higher status counterparts. The psychological impact of performing routine administrative and maintenance functions was profound for beings who had previously operated as autonomous agents of cosmic-level power, creating resentment and identity conflicts that would eventually contribute to the Citadel's internal instability and ultimate destruction. The bureaucratic structures that developed within the Citadel were paradoxically both necessary for its functioning and antithetical to everything that Rick identity represented across the multiverse. The forms, procedures, and administrative protocols that enabled coordination among thousands of Ricks also constrained individual autonomy and creativity in ways that made many residents feel trapped within systems they had helped to create, but could no longer control or escape without abandoning the benefits that Citadel membership provided. The Rick police force that emerged to maintain order within the Citadel represented perhaps the most psychologically disturbing development in the organization's evolution toward conventional governmental authority. The sight of Ricks arresting other Ricks for violations of collectively agreed upon rules created cognitive dissonance that challenged fundamental assumptions about Rick superiority and independence that had previously provided psychological foundation for their sense of identity and purpose. The administrative divisions that managed different aspects of Citadel operations developed their own cultures, priorities, and internal politics that often conflicted with the broader goals and values that had motivated the organization's creation. The Rick civil servants who processed paperwork, managed databases, and coordinated logistics found themselves increasingly disconnected from the scientific and exploratory activities that had originally attracted them to participate in collective Rick endeavors. The Morty assignment system that the Citadel developed represented the most systematic and morally troubling application of Rick organizational capabilities to the management of relationships that should have remained personal and voluntary. The bureaucratization of Rick-Morty relationships transformed grandsons from family members into standardized resources that could be distributed according to administrative criteria rather than emotional bonds or mutual compatibility. The Morty breeding programs that some Citadel factions proposed during debates about ensuring adequate Morty supplies revealed the extent to which institutional thinking had corrupted Rick understanding of the ethical implications of their technological capabilities. The casual discussion of artificially producing Mortys for assignment to Rickless residents demonstrated how quickly collective governance could evolve toward treating sentient beings as manufacturing problems to be solved through efficient resource allocation. The economic systems that developed within the Citadel were simultaneously sophisticated and absurd, representing the application of Rick-level intelligence to problems that seemed trivial compared to the cosmic challenges that individual Ricks typically addressed through their independent research and exploration activities. The cookie factories that employed Rick workers in repetitive manufacturing processes became symbols of how genius could be wasted through institutional structures that prioritize stability and predictability over innovation and discovery. The service industries that emerged to meet the daily needs of Citadel residents created economic relationships among RICs that had no precedent in their previous individual experiences of multiversal existence. The RIC restaurateurs, maintenance workers, and customer service representatives who staffed these businesses found themselves in positions that required them to treat other RICs as customers and clients rather than equals, creating power dynamics that contradicted their shared assumptions about RIC identity and mutual respect. The currency systems that the Citadel implemented to facilitate trade and resource allocation among residents represented attempts to quantify and commodify RIC contributions to collective welfare in ways that reduced complex scientific and social activities to numerical values that could be compared and exchanged through market mechanisms. The psychological impact of having their work evaluated and compensated through standardized payment systems was particularly difficult for beings who had previously operated outside any form of external performance measurement. The law enforcement challenges that emerged as the Citadel population grew highlighted the fundamental contradictions in attempting to police a society composed entirely of beings who possessed the intelligence and technological capability to circumvent or override any form of external control when they chose to do so. The RIC officers who volunteered for police duties found themselves in the impossible position of enforcing rules among people who were intellectually equipped to identify and exploit the logical and practical limitations of any regulatory system. The educational institutions that the Citadel established to train new residents and provide specialized instruction in collective governance procedures represented attempts to systematize and transfer knowledge that had previously been acquired through individual experience and personal trial and error learning processes. The RIC professors and administrators who staffed these institutions found themselves teaching subjects that seemed to contradict the fundamental RIC value of learning through direct experimentation and personal discovery. The Morty Academy that provided training for displaced Mortys represented the Citadel's most ambitious attempt to address the humanitarian crisis created by RIC activities across the multiverse, while also serving the practical needs of RICs who required Morty companions for their continued psychological stability and adventure activities. The curriculum that prepared RICless Mortys for reassignment to new RICs reflected disturbing assumptions about Morty interchangeability and the extent to which their individual personalities and preferences were considered irrelevant to successful RIC-Morty relationships. The specialized training programs that prepared Mortys for different types of RIC assignments revealed the extent to which the Citadel had analyzed and systematized aspects of RIC-Morty relationships that should have remained organic and personally determined. The classification of RICs according to their adventure preferences, risk tolerance, and emotional needs enabled more efficient Morty assignment, but also reduced complex interpersonal relationships to administrative categories that ignored the unique aspects of individual RIC and Morty personalities. The housing systems that the Citadel developed to accommodate its growing population reflected both the practical constraints of life in an artificial pocket dimension and the social hierarchies that had emerged among different classes of day RIC residents. The luxury apartments reserved for visiting cool RICs contrasted sharply with the dormitory-style accommodations provided for worker RICs, creating visible symbols of status difference that reinforced the class divisions that were undermining the Citadel's original egalitarian ideals. The transportation networks that connected different sections of the Citadel were designed with efficiency and security as primary considerations, but their implementation created restrictions on RIC movement, and access that many residents experienced as forms of control and surveillance that violated their expectations of individual autonomy within collective institutions. The need for identification cards, travel permits, and security clearances to access certain areas transformed the Citadel from a refuge into a form of bureaucratic prison for some of its inhabitants. The communication systems that enabled coordination among Citadel departments and residents also created opportunities for monitoring and surveillance that made some RICs uncomfortable about the level of privacy and independence they retained within the organization. The knowledge that their conversations, research activities, and personal relationships were potentially subject to administrative oversight created psychological pressures that affected how RICs interacted with each other and pursued their individual interests. The maintenance and infrastructure requirements of sustaining a complex artificial dimension created ongoing demands for RIC labor and attention that diverted resources from the scientific and exploratory activities that had originally motivated participation in collective endeavors. The RIC engineers and technicians who maintained the Citadel's systems found themselves in essential but unglamorous roles that provided little opportunity for the kind of creative problem-solving and discovery that made RIC existence meaningful and satisfying. The waste management and resource recycling systems that the Citadel required to maintain environmental sustainability within its enclosed dimension represented applications of RIC intelligence to mundane problems that seemed beneath their capabilities but were necessary for the continued functioning of their society. The RICs, who specialized in these areas, developed expertise that was valuable to the collective but provided limited opportunities for the kind of cosmic-scale impact that RICs typically sought through their individual activities. The medical and psychological services that the Citadel provided to address RIC mental health and addiction issues represented acknowledgement of problems that individual RICs had typically dealt with through isolation, self-medication, or dimensional abandonment, rather than seeking professional help from other RICs who might understand their unique psychological challenges. The RIC therapists and counselors who staffed these services faced the complex task of treating patients who possessed the same level of intelligence as their providers, while dealing with problems that arose from the fundamental contradictions of RIC existence. The entertainment and recreational facilities that the Citadel established to provide RIC residents with leisure activities and social opportunities reflected attempts to address the psychological needs of beings whose individual lives had typically been characterized by constant stimulation. Through adventure, discovery, and crisis management, the RIC entertainers, athletes, and social coordinators who organized these activities found themselves in the unusual position of trying to amuse and engage audiences who were intellectually capable of analyzing and predicting every aspect of their performances. The research and development facilities that the Citadel maintained represented attempts to channel collective RIC intelligence toward projects that benefited the entire organization, while also providing individual RICs with opportunities to pursue their scientific interests within collaborative frameworks. The coordination of research activities among RICs with similar interests but different approaches to problem solving created both opportunities for breakthrough discoveries and sources of conflict over methodology, credit, and resource allocation. The quality control and safety oversight systems that the Citadel implemented to prevent individual RIC projects from endangering the collective welfare of all residents represented forms of institutional control that many RICs found intrusive and counterproductive to the kind of experimental freedom that had previously characterized their individual research activities. The RIC safety inspectors and regulatory compliance officers who enforced these systems found themselves in adversarial relationships with other RICs who viewed oversight as limitation of their fundamental rights to pursue knowledge and innovation without external interference. The external relations departments that managed the Citadel's interactions with other multiversal organizations and governments required RICs to engage in diplomatic activities and political negotiations that contradicted their traditional approach of solving problems through superior technology and individual action, rather than compromise and collective decision-making. The RIC diplomats and negotiators who represented the Citadel in these contexts found themselves constrained by collective positions and policies that often conflicted with their personal judgments about optimal strategies for achieving desired outcomes. The paradox of individual genius creating collective mediocrity became increasingly apparent as the Citadel's bureaucratic structures grew more complex and comprehensive in their attempts to coordinate and control RIC activities for the benefit of all residents. The same intelligence that had enabled individual RICs to manipulate fundamental forces of reality became trapped within administrative systems that reduced cosmic-level capabilities to routine organizational functions that provided stability at the cost of the innovation and discovery that made RIC existence meaningful. The systematic commodification of Mortys within the Citadel's operational framework represented perhaps the most morally disturbing evolution of RIC collective thinking, transforming what should have been organic family relationships into standardized administrative procedures that treated sentient beings as interchangeable components in a vast machine designed to serve RIC's psychological and practical needs. The Morty assignment system that emerged from early Citadel policies reflected the organization's fundamental inability to reconcile its humanitarian pretensions with the underlying RIC assumption that other beings existed primarily as resources to be optimized and allocated according to efficiency criteria, rather than respected as autonomous individuals with their own rights and interests. The bureaucratic processes that governed Morty distribution within the Citadel required extensive documentation and evaluation procedures that reduced complex interpersonal relationships to standardized categories and compatibility metrics that could be processed by administrative staff who had never experienced the emotional bonds that typically connected RICs and Mortys across dimensions. The forms and questionnaires that RIC applicants completed to request Morty assignments asked detailed questions about adventure preferences, risk tolerance, and disciplinary approaches that revealed the extent to which the Citadel had analyzed and systematized aspects of grandfather-grandson relationships that should have remained personal and intuitive. The Morty evaluation procedures that determined compatibility between available Mortys and requesting RICs involved psychological testing, behavioral observation, and personality profiling that treated 14-year-old boys as products undergoing quality control inspection rather than traumatized children who had lost their families and needed care, stability, and emotional support rather than efficient placement. With strangers who shared genetic similarities, but no actual relationship history or emotional connection. The psychological impact on Mortys of being processed through the Citadel's assignment system was profound and lasting, creating identity confusion and attachment disorders that reflected their treatment as commodities rather than people with legitimate emotional needs and developmental requirements. The Mortys who had lost their original RICs through death, dimensional abandonment, or Citadel conflicts found themselves in institutional care that provided basic physical necessities while failing to address the trauma of losing their families and the additional stress of being evaluated for suitability as companions. For Strangers, the Morty Academy that prepared displaced Mortys for reassignment to new Ricks represented the Citadel's most systematic attempt to standardize and optimize the process of matching grandsons with grandfathers who had no organic relationship but were expected to develop functional partnerships. For interdimensional adventure activities that required trust, cooperation, and mutual understanding that typically developed over years of shared experience rather than administrative decree and institutional training. The curriculum at the Morty Academy reflected disturbing assumptions about Morty interchangeability and the extent to which their individual personalities, interests, and emotional needs were considered irrelevant to successful Rick-Morty relationships. The standardized training modules that all Mortys received regardless of their personal backgrounds or psychological profiles included instruction in portal gun operation, basic science concepts, crisis management techniques, and emotional regulation strategies designed to make them more useful and less problematic as Rick companions. The specialized tracks within the Academy that prepared Mortys for assignment to different categories of Ricks revealed the extent to which the Citadel had classified and systematized Rick personality types according to their adventure, preferences, emotional stability, and relationship management approaches. The Mortys destined for cool Ricks received training in advanced technology operation and high-stakes decision-making, while those assigned to worker Ricks learned more basic skills focused on routine support activities and emotional comfort provision. The psychological conditioning that Academy Mortys received was designed to minimize attachment issues and emotional resistance that might interfere with their ability to bond with assigned Ricks who bore no resemblance to their original grandfathers beyond genetic similarity and shared name. Recognition. The therapy sessions and behavioral modification programs that addressed Morty grief, anxiety, and identity confusion were focused on producing compliant and adaptable companions, rather than supporting healthy emotional development and psychological recovery from trauma. The Rickless Mortys who remained unassigned due to behavioral problems, psychological issues, or simple surplus population dynamics represented the Citadel's most visible failure to address the humanitarian crisis that Rick activities created across the multiverse. These displaced children were housed in dormitory-style facilities that provided basic necessities while offering limited opportunities for education, personal development, or meaningful social connection with peers who shared similar experiences of loss and institutional placement. The Morty slums that developed in lower status areas of the Citadel reflected both the organization's resource allocation priorities and its fundamental disregard for the welfare of beings who were not contributing directly to Rick objectives and activities. The overcrowded, understaffed facilities where surplus Mortys lived created conditions that would have been considered scandalous in any conventional society, but were treated as acceptable by Ricks, who viewed Morty welfare as secondary to their own convenience and institutional efficiency. The social hierarchies that emerged among Mortys within the Citadel mirrored the class divisions that characterized Rick society, but were even more painful for children and adolescents who had been displaced from their families and were struggling to develop stable identities within institutional frameworks that treated them as commodities rather than people. The Mortys, who were successfully assigned to high-status Ricks, enjoyed privileges and opportunities that were denied to their peers in the general population, creating resentment and competition that prevented the formation of mutual support networks that might have provided emotional stability and collective resistance to their commodification. The Morty police officers who worked alongside Rick law enforcement represented attempts to provide Mortys with career opportunities and social mobility within the Citadel's hierarchical structure. But their roles also highlighted the extent to which even relatively privileged Mortys remained subordinate to Rick authority and were expected to enforce systems that maintained their own oppression and that of their peers. The psychological complexity of Mortys policing other Mortys on behalf of Rick institutional interests created identity conflicts that reflected the broader contradictions of Morty existence within Rick-dominated society. The breeding programs that some Citadel factions proposed during debates about ensuring adequate Morty supplies represented the logical endpoint of Rick thinking about Morty commodification, treating the artificial production of sentient beings as a manufacturing problem that could be solved through technological innovation and resource optimization, rather than recognizing the profound ethical implications of creating people, specifically to serve as companions and assistants for other beings who viewed them as interchangeable resources. The genetic modification research that accompanied discussions of Morty breeding focused on enhancing traits that would make artificially produced Mortys more useful and manageable as Rick companions, while minimizing characteristics that might interfere with their primary function as adventure partners and emotional support providers. The casual way that Ricks discussed altering human consciousness and personality through genetic manipulation revealed the extent to which their cosmic perspective had severed their connection to normal moral considerations about the rights and dignity of beings they perceived as inferior. The quality control standards that would have governed artificially produced Mortys reflected Rick preferences for companions who possessed optimal combinations of intelligence, courage, loyalty, and emotional stability, while avoiding problematic traits like excessive curiosity, independent thinking, or resistance to authority that might interfere with smooth Rick-Morty relationship dynamics. The standardization of human personality through technological manipulation represented the ultimate expression of Rick's inability to value other beings for their own sake rather than their utility as resources in Rick projects and activities. The psychological research that some Citadel scientists conducted on Rick-Morty relationship dynamics was motivated by desire to optimize pairing procedures and training programs, rather than genuine interest in understanding or improving the emotional welfare of Mortys who were struggling to adapt to institutional placement and assignment to strangers. The studies that analyzed successful and unsuccessful Rick-Morty partnerships focused on identifying predictable patterns that could be used to improve administrative efficiency rather than developing interventions that might address the trauma and adjustment difficulties that affected most displaced Mortys. The therapy services that the Citadel provided for Mortys experiencing adjustment difficulties were designed to modify Morty behavior and emotional responses to make them more compatible with Rick expectations rather than addressing the legitimate grief, anger, and identity confusion that resulted from family loss and institutional placement. The Morty counselors who staffed these services were trained to help their clients adapt to circumstances rather than advocate for changes in policies and procedures that created unnecessary suffering and psychological damage. The educational programs that supplemented Morty Academy training were focused on subjects and skills that would enhance Morty value as Rick companions, rather than providing comprehensive intellectual development that might enable Mortys to pursue independent goals and careers that did not revolve around serving Rick needs and interests. The science classes, adventure simulation exercises, and technology training that dominated the curriculum reflected Rick assumptions about appropriate Morty development rather than consideration of what educational opportunities might best serve Morty interests and potential. The recreational activities and social programs that the Citadel provided for Morty residents were limited in scope and resources compared to similar services available to Rick's, reflecting the organization's priority structure and its treatment of Morty welfare as secondary to Rick's satisfaction and institutional efficiency. The sports leagues, hobby clubs, and entertainment events that were available to Mortys operated on restricted schedules and budgets that reinforced their subordinate status within Citadel society. The cultural developments that emerged among Mortys within the Citadel reflected both their shared experiences of displacement and institutional control, and their attempts to maintain individual identity and emotional connection despite systematic pressure to conform to standardized roles as Rick companions. The informal support networks, creative expressions, and resistance activities that developed among Morty populations represented forms of psychological survival and collective identity formation that occurred despite, rather than because of Citadel policies and programs. The long-term psychological effects of Citadel policies on Morty development and mental health were largely ignored by Rick administrators who were focused on immediate operational needs rather than consideration of how institutional treatment might affect the people they were ostensibly trying to help through organized care and placement services. The patterns of anxiety, depression, identity confusion, and attachment disorders that characterized many Citadel Mortys reflected the psychological cost of treating children as administrative problems rather than individuals deserving of respect, care, and opportunities for healthy development. The ethical blindness that characterized Rick's approaches to Morty welfare within the Citadel reflected broader patterns of moral reasoning that treated utilitarian efficiency as the primary criterion for evaluating policies and procedures, without adequate consideration of rights-based or virtue-based ethical frameworks that might have provided different perspectives on appropriate treatment of vulnerable populations who depended on institutional care and protection. The seeds of Morty resentment that grew within the Citadel's population were nurtured by daily experiences of commodification, subordination, and systematic disregard for their individual welfare that created psychological conditions conducive to the emergence of organized resistance movements and charismatic leaders who could articulate Morty grievances and mobilize collective action against Rick. Institutional authority that treated them as resources rather than people deserving of basic respect and autonomy. The systematic nature of Morty oppression within the Citadel created shared experiences and common interests among displaced children and adolescents who might otherwise have remained isolated in their individual struggles with trauma, identity formation, and adjustment to life without their original families. The institutional structures that were designed to optimize Morty utility as Rick companions inadvertently created conditions for the development of Morty solidarity and collective consciousness that would eventually threaten the entire foundation of Rick-dominated society within the Citadel. The relationship between Rick C-137 and the Council of Ricks was characterized from its earliest moments by mutual antagonism, rooted in fundamentally incompatible philosophies about the nature of Rick identity and the proper relationship between individual autonomy and collective responsibility. Rick C-137's reputation as a brilliant but dangerously unpredictable Rick who operated outside conventional moral and institutional constraints made him simultaneously valuable as a potential ally, threatening as an uncontrollable variable in the Council's efforts to manage Rick activities across the central finite curve. The Council's initial attempts to establish contact with Rick C-137 were motivated by practical recognition that his capabilities and willingness to use extreme methods made him potentially useful for addressing threats that conventional Citadel resources might not be adequate to handle effectively. The same qualities that made Rick C-137 unsuitable for routine Citadel membership also made him an attractive resource for situations that required unconventional approaches and disregard for normal procedural limitations that constrained other Ricks operating within institutional frameworks. Rick C-137's first documented encounter with Citadel authority occurred when Council agents arrested him for investigation in connection with the systematic murder of 27 Ricks across multiple dimensions, crimes that bore superficial similarities to Rick C-137's known methods and psychological profile, but differed in crucial details that suggested either evolution in his techniques or the involvement of a different perpetrator entirely. The arrest itself required extraordinary resources and careful planning to overcome Rick C-137's defensive capabilities and portal technology advantages. The interrogation process that followed Rick C-137's capture revealed both the sophisticated analytical capabilities that the Council had developed for understanding Rick's psychology and the fundamental limitations of institutional approaches to managing beings whose intelligence and technological resources exceeded anything that conventional law enforcement or governmental authority could contain through normal procedures. The Council's assumption that Rick C-137 could be intimidated or controlled through displays of superior organization and collective power proved to be based on incomplete understanding of his psychological profile and motivational structure. Rick C-137's responses to Council questioning demonstrated his contempt for institutional authority and his rejection of collective moral frameworks that might constrain individual Rick freedom to pursue personal objectives without regard for broader consequences or community standards. His casual dismissal of Council concerns about multiversal stability and Rick cooperation reflected philosophical commitments to nihilistic individualism that made compromise or accommodation with Citadel objectives fundamentally impossible. The investigation that the Council conducted into the Rick murders revealed the sophistication of their intelligence gathering and analytical capabilities, while also highlighting their dependence on cooperative relationships with Rick, subjects who were willing to provide information and assistance in exchange for Citadel services and protection. Rick C-137's refusal to participate constructively in the investigation created obstacles that forced Council agents to develop alternative approaches to evidence gathering that did not rely on suspect cooperation. The discovery that Rick C-137 was not responsible for the murders being investigated created an awkward situation for Council leadership that had committed significant resources to his capture and interrogation based on circumstantial evidence and behavioral profiling that proved to be inadequate for definitively establishing guilt or innocence. The need to acknowledge error while maintaining institutional credibility and authority created political complications that affected Council relationships with other Ricks who were observing the investigation's progress. Rick C-137's cooperation with the Council's investigation into the actual perpetrator of the Rick murders was motivated not by respect for Citadel authority or commitment to collective justice, but by personal interest in identifying and confronting whoever was impersonating his methods and potentially damaging his reputation through inferior execution of systematic Rick elimination techniques. His assistance was provided on his own terms and according to his own priorities rather than Council directives or procedural requirements. The revelation that the Rick murders were actually orchestrated by a Morty rather than a Rick created profound psychological and philosophical challenges for Council members who had assumed that only Rick-level intelligence could plan and execute such sophisticated campaigns of violence and deception. The discovery that a supposedly inferior being had successfully manipulated Rick's psychology and exploited their assumptions about relative intelligence capabilities forced uncomfortable reconsiderations of basic assumptions about Rick, superiority and security. Rick C-137's dramatic escape from Citadel custody was accomplished through methods that revealed both his superior individual capabilities and the fundamental vulnerability of institutional systems when confronted by beings who possessed the intelligence and resources necessary to exploit their structural limitations and procedural constraints. The escape demonstrated that no form of Rick collective organization could reliably contain or control individual Ricks who chose to resist institutional authority through direct action. The assassination of the original Council of Ricks that Rick C-137 accomplished during his escape represented both personal revenge for his detention and symbolic rejection of the entire concept of Rick collective governance through institutional means. The systematic elimination of council leadership was conducted with clinical efficiency that matched Rick C-137's reputation for thorough and decisive action when confronting obstacles to his individual autonomy and freedom of movement. The power vacuum that resulted from the Council's destruction created immediate crises of leadership and institutional continuity that threatened the Citadel's ability to maintain basic services and coordinate responses to ongoing multiversal threats that required collective Rick resources and capabilities. The remaining Citadel administrators and department heads found themselves attempting to manage complex organizational functions without clear authority structures or decision-making procedures that could provide direction for institutional responses to emergency situations. The chaos that followed the Council's assassination revealed the extent to which Citadel operations had become dependent on centralized leadership and bureaucratic procedures that could not function effectively when subjected to sudden disruption and institutional trauma. The Rick residents who had relied on Citadel services and coordination found themselves struggling to maintain individual activities and relationships without the support systems and resources that institutional membership had previously provided. Rick C-137's demonstration of institutional vulnerability had profound psychological effects on surviving Citadel Ricks who were forced to confront the reality that their collective organization offered no reliable protection against individual Ricks who chose to pursue destructive objectives through direct action rather than working within established procedures and authority structures. The recognition that institutional membership might actually increase rather than decrease their exposure to Rick-related violence created anxiety and doubt about the fundamental assumptions underlying Citadel society. The rebuilding efforts that eventually restored Citadel operations were motivated by practical necessity rather than renewed confidence in institutional approaches to Rick collective governance, reflecting recognition among surviving Ricks that despite its vulnerabilities and limitations, the Citadel still provided resources and services that individual Ricks could not easily replace through independent action. The new leadership that emerged from the rebuilding process was more cautious and defensive in its approach to external relations and institutional security. The lessons that Citadel leadership drew from Rick C-137's successful assault on their institutional authority included both tactical improvements in security procedures and strategic reconsiderations of both team policies toward independent Ricks who operated outside Citadel, oversight and control. The new protocols that were developed to prevent similar attacks reflected both realistic assessment of institutional vulnerabilities and continued commitment to collective Rick governance despite demonstrated risks and limitations. The monitoring systems that the rebuilt Citadel established to track Rick C-137's activities reflected ongoing concern about his potential to create additional problems that might affect Citadel operations, and the welfare of Ricks, who had chosen institutional membership over individual independence. The intelligence-gathering efforts that focused on his adventures, relationships, and technological developments revealed both institutional paranoia and legitimate security concerns about future conflicts. Rick C-137's continued success at operating independently while solving complex problems and avoiding institutional constraints provided alternative models for Rick behavior that competed with Citadel approaches to multiversal existence and challenge management. His achievements in individual problem-solving and crisis resolution without institutional support or collective cooperation undermined council arguments about the necessity and benefits of Rick organizational membership and coordination. The philosophical implications of Rick C-137's relationship with Citadel authority extended beyond immediate practical conflicts to encompass fundamental questions about the compatibility of Rick genius with collective governance and institutional constraint that could not be resolved through technological innovation or administrative reform. The antagonism between individual Rick autonomy and collective Rick welfare represented tensions that were inherent in Rick psychology rather than problems that could be solved through better policies or procedures. The reputation that Rick C-137 developed among Citadel Ricks as both dangerous enemy and admirable exemplar of pure Rick values created internal contradictions and loyalty conflicts that complicated institutional unity and collective decision-making processes. The Rick residents who secretly admired his independence while publicly supporting institutional membership represented potential security threats and sources of internal subversion that council leadership struggled to identify and address effectively. The symbolic significance of Rick C-137 as the Rick who refused to be controlled or contained by collective authority made him a focal point for broader debates about Rick identity and the proper relationship between individual genius and social responsibility that divided Citadel society and undermined institutional cohesion. His example provided inspiration for Ricks who questioned institutional membership, while also serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute individual autonomy. The long-term effects of Rick C-137's conflicts with Citadel authority included both institutional adaptations that made the organization more resilient and defensive, and philosophical developments that acknowledged the fundamental limitations of Rick collective governance when confronted by individual Ricks who possessed sufficient capability and motivation to resist institutional control through direct action. The recognition that some Ricks could not be integrated into collective frameworks forced acknowledgement of limitations that challenged basic assumptions about the universality and sustainability of institutional approaches to Rick coordination. The ongoing tension between Rick C-137's individual success and institutional approaches to collective Rick welfare created psychological pressure on Citadel members who were forced to choose between admiring his achievements and supporting the organizational systems that provided them with security and resources, but constrained their individual autonomy and creative expression. The competition between individual excellence and collective mediocrity that his example represented could not be resolved through institutional reform or policy adjustment. The precedent that Rick C-137 established for individual resistance to collective authority provided both inspiration and practical guidance for future conflicts between institutional Ricks and independent operators who chose to reject organizational membership in favor of individual autonomy and self-determination. His demonstration that institutional power could be successfully challenged and overcome encouraged other Ricks to question the necessity and benefits of collective governance, while highlighting the costs and risks associated with institutional membership and bureaucratic constraint. The rebuilding of the Citadel following the assassination of the original Council of Ricks represented both an opportunity to address the structural problems that had contributed to institutional dysfunction and a testament to the TACE's fundamental inability of Rick collective governance to learn from its own failures and contradictions. The Ricks, who emerged as leaders during the Reconstruction period, were motivated by practical necessity rather than philosophical innovation, seeking to restore the services and coordination that had made Citadel membership valuable, while avoiding the concentrated authority structures that had made the organization vulnerable to individual attack and institutional destruction. The democratic reforms that characterized the new Citadel governance system reflected both genuine commitment to preventing future concentration of power in vulnerable leadership structures and naive assumptions about the compatibility democratic processes with Rick psychology and the practical requirements of managing a complex interdimensional organization. The Rick political theorists, who designed the new constitutional framework, failed to adequately consider how beings of cosmic-level intelligence and ego would adapt democratic institutions to serve their individual interests, rather than collective welfare. The campaign season that preceded the first democratic elections in Citadel history revealed the full scope of Rick creativity and ruthlessness when applied to political competition, rather than scientific research or interdimensional adventure activities. The candidate platforms that emerged reflected every possible variation of Rick philosophy about individual autonomy, collective responsibility, institutional efficiency, and multiversal policy, creating a bewildering array of choices that confused voters while providing opportunities for sophisticated manipulation of electoral processes by candidates with superior strategic thinking and technological resources. The Rick presidential candidates who participated in the electoral process included representatives of every major faction and interest group within Citadel society, from hardcore individualists who promised to dismantle most institutional functions to committed collectivists who advocated for expanded government services and increased coordination with other multiversal organizations. The diversity of candidate positions reflected the fundamental divisions within Rick society that democratic processes were supposed to resolve through peaceful competition and majority rule rather than violence and institutional destruction. The campaign strategies that different Rick candidates employed revealed both their sophisticated understanding of electoral dynamics and their fundamental inability to engage in genuinely collaborative political processes that required compromise, coalition building, and acknowledgement of legitimate opposition interests. The negative advertising, strategic manipulation, and technological advantages that candidates deployed against each other created electoral dynamics that resembled warfare more than democratic competition between alternative approaches to collective governance. The Morty candidate, who emerged as a dark horse contender during the final weeks of the campaign, was initially dismissed by Rick political observers as a symbolic gesture rather than a serious challenge to established Rick leadership within the Citadel's power structure. The assumption that no Morty possessed the intellectual capability or political sophistication necessary to compete effectively against Rick candidates reflected the systematic underestimation of Morty potential that had characterized Rick attitudes throughout the Citadel's history and Development. The campaign platform that the Morty candidate presented to voters combined populist appeals to Rickless Mortys and worker Ricks, who felt marginalized by existing institutional structures, with sophisticated policy proposals that demonstrated understanding of Citadel operations and multiversal challenges that exceeded what most Rick observers had thought any Morty could achieve through independent study and analysis. The candidate's ability to articulate complex positions and respond effectively to criticism revealed capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about Rick-Morty intellectual relationships. The debate performances that established the Morty candidate as a legitimate contender for Citadel leadership demonstrated rhetorical skills and strategic thinking that outmaneuvered several prominent Rick candidates while appealing to voter concerns about institutional reform and social justice that had been ignored or dismissed by traditional Rick political leadership. The candidate's ability to connect with diverse constituencies while maintaining coherent policy positions suggested political talents that transcended simple intelligence and reflected sophisticated understanding of power dynamics and coalition building. The electoral strategy that enabled the Morty candidate's victory combined grassroots organizing among previously disenfranchised populations with sophisticated manipulation of media coverage and public opinion that exploited Rick assumptions about Morty limitations while building broad-based support for institutional change and reform. The campaign's success in mobilizing Rickless Mortys, worker Ricks, and other marginalized groups created a coalition that overcame the natural advantages that cool Ricks and institutional elites had traditionally enjoyed in Citadel politics. The election night results that confirmed the Morty candidate's victory shocked Rick political establishments and created immediate crises of legitimacy and institutional continuity that revealed the extent to which Citadel governance had depended on assumptions about natural Rick leadership and Morty subordination that could not survive direct challenge through democratic processes. The peaceful transition of power that followed the election masked underlying tensions and resistance that would soon emerge as threats to the new administration's authority and effectiveness. The inauguration ceremony that installed the first Morty president in Citadel history was conducted with elaborate symbolism designed to emphasize both institutional continuity and democratic legitimacy, while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of Morty leadership within Rick-dominated society. The speeches and celebrations that marked the transition obscured the reality that many Ricks remained fundamentally opposed to Morty authority and were already planning resistance activities that would test the new government's ability to maintain order and implement policy changes. The cabinet appointments that the new Morty president announced during the transition period revealed both strategic political thinking and the practical constraints of governing a society where most qualified administrators and technical experts belonged to populations that had opposed his candidacy and remained skeptical of his authority and capabilities. The balance between reform-minded appointees and institutional continuity figures reflected the complex challenge of implementing change while maintaining operational stability. The policy agenda that the Morty administration presented to the Citadel legislature combined ambitious reform proposals with practical recognition of the institutional and political constraints that limited what could be accomplished through normal democratic processes when governing a population of beings who possessed the intelligence and resources to circumvent or resist government authority through individual action. The legislative strategy that emerged reflected sophisticated understanding of Citadel power dynamics and the need to build sustainable coalitions for institutional change. The resistance that emerged among Rick elites to Morty presidential authority took forms that ranged from passive non-compliance with administrative directives to active sabotage of government operations and policy implementation, efforts that threatened institutional functionality and public order. The RIC bureaucrats, department heads, and technical specialists who controlled essential Citadel services found numerous ways to undermine presidential authority without engaging in direct confrontation that might justify harsh countermeasures. The consolidation of power that the Morty president implemented in response to elite resistance represented a systematic campaign to eliminate opposition and establish unchallenged authority that contradicted the democratic principles and institutional constraints that had enabled his electoral victory and peaceful assumption of office. The transformation from reform-minded democratic leader to authoritarian ruler occurred gradually but inexorably, as the practical challenges of governing RICs revealed the inadequacy of conventional political approaches to managing beings of cosmic-level intelligence and ego. The elimination of opposition figures that characterized the president's consolidation campaign was conducted with clinical efficiency that revealed both technological sophistication and strategic planning that exceeded what most observers had believed any Morty could achieve through independent preparation and resource acquisition. The systematic nature of the purges suggested long-term preparation and coordination that contradicted assumptions about spontaneous political developments and democratic transitions within Citadel society. The airlock executions that became the signature method for disposing of political opponents combined practical efficiency with psychological warfare designed to intimidate potential resistance, while demonstrating the new administration's willingness to use extreme methods to maintain authority and implement policy changes. The public nature of these eliminations served both as warning to potential opponents and as demonstration of presidential power that established new parameters for political opposition and institutional dissent. The cabinet purges that followed the initial elimination of prominent opposition figures revealed the extent to which the Morty president had infiltrated and monitored existing power structures during his campaign and early presidency, using information gathering and surveillance capabilities that enabled him to identify and neutralize threats before they could organize effective resistance to his authority. The systematic nature of these eliminations suggested preparation and planning that had preceded his electoral victory by significant periods. The revelation that the democratically elected Morty president was actually evil Morty represented both the culmination of years of strategic planning and preparation and the ultimate demonstration of Morty potential for sophisticated political manipulation and institutional control that exceeded anything RIC political theorists had considered possible when designing democratic reforms for Citadel governance. The identity disclosure transformed understanding of recent political developments from democratic transition to elaborate deception and manipulation campaign. The strategic brilliance that evil Morty had demonstrated through his successful infiltration and capture of Citadel political authority revealed capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about RIC intellectual superiority and the natural hierarchy that was supposed to govern RIC-Morty relationships across all dimensions and circumstances. The revelation that a Morty had outmaneuvered the entire RIC political establishment suggested that assumptions about relative intelligence and capability had been based on incomplete understanding rather than objective analysis. The institutional knowledge that evil Morty had acquired during his campaign and early presidency provided him with comprehensive understanding of Citadel operations, security procedures, and technological capabilities that would prove essential for his ultimate objectives of escape and institutional destruction. The access to classified information and strategic resources that presidential authority provided enabled him to plan and prepare for activities that would have been impossible from his previous position as displaced Morty seeking assignment and integration. The long-term planning that evil Morty's successful political campaign represented suggested preparation and strategic thinking that had extended over years of apparent cooperation with Citadel systems while secretly developing the resources, knowledge, and capabilities necessary to achieve complete control over Rick civilization's most ambitious institutional experiment. The patience and discipline required for such extended deception revealed psychological characteristics that contradicted Rick assumptions about Morty impulsiveness and limited planning horizons. The irony that Rick democracy had enabled its own destruction through the elevation of a Morty leader who was fundamentally committed to the elimination of Rick authority and institutional power highlighted the fundamental contradictions and blind spots that had characterized Rick approaches to collective governance throughout the Citadel's history. The democratic processes that were supposed to provide peaceful alternatives to violence and institutional destruction had instead provided sophisticated enemies with legitimate pathways to absolute power and strategic position for comprehensive assault on Rick's civilization. The transformation of the Citadel from democratic experiment to authoritarian state under evil Morty's leadership represented both the logical culmination of Rick's inability to sustain genuine democratic institutions and the beginning of systematic preparation for the final assault on the central finite curve that would ultimately destroy Rick civilization's greatest achievement and enable evil Morty's escape to unlimited multiversal freedom beyond the boundaries that Rick narcissism had imposed on infinite reality. The consolidation of power that evil Morty achieved through democratic processes and subsequent authoritarian methods provided him with resources and authority that no individual Morty had ever possessed within Rick-dominated society, creating the foundation for activities and objectives that would ultimately challenge not just Citadel governance, but the fundamental structure of reality within the central finite curve that had confined countless beings to existence, within Rick-controlled dimensions where their intellectual superiority was artificially guaranteed through cosmic-scale manipulation and imprisonment. The discovery of the central finite curve represented the most profound and devastating revelation in the history of Rick consciousness across infinite dimensions, transforming every assumption about multiversal existence from expressions of cosmic freedom into evidence of the most elaborate prison ever constructed by intelligent beings, seeking to avoid confrontation with their own limitations and moral failures. Evil Morty's access to classified Citadel databases and his systematic investigation of dimensional physics during his consolidation of presidential power had led him to uncover mathematical relationships and technological signatures that revealed the artificial nature of the reality barriers that confined all Rick-dominated dimensions within carefully selected parameters designed to ensure Rick intellectual superiority. The technological sophistication required to identify and isolate every dimension where Rick Sanchez represented the most intelligent being exceeded anything that conventional scientific analysis had previously suggested was possible, even for Rick-level intelligence operating with unlimited resources and multiversal access. The computational requirements for surveying infinite realities and categorizing them according to criteria that prioritized Rick ego satisfaction over all other considerations represented an achievement that was simultaneously magnificent in its scope and horrifying in its implications for the countless beings who had been unknowingly imprisoned within its boundaries. The mathematical elegance of the central finite curve's construction reflected the same genius that had enabled Rick's greatest scientific achievements throughout his individual career, but channeled toward an objective that revealed the fundamental narcissism and moral emptiness that lay beneath his claims of nihilistic indifference to multiversal welfare and cosmic justice. The equations that governed the dimensional barrier's operation were beautiful in their complexity and precision, but their purpose was to ensure that Rick would never have to confront evidence of his own intellectual or moral inadequacy through exposure to realities where other beings might demonstrate superior capabilities or wisdom. The scope of imprisonment that the central finite curve represented encompassed not just the Ricks who had constructed and maintained the barrier, but every conscious being within the selected dimensions whose entire existence had been predetermined by Rick's psychological need to remain the most important and capable person in any reality he might choose to inhabit. The billions of Mortys, Beths, Jerrys, Summers, and countless other species who lived their complete lives within the artificial boundaries had no awareness that their experiences, relationships, and opportunities for growth and development were constrained by cosmic-scale manipulation, designed to serve the emotional requirements of beings who viewed them as supporting characters in Rick-centered narratives. Evil Morty's analysis of the central finite curve's operational parameters revealed both the technical methods by which infinite realities had been surveyed and categorized, and the psychological criteria that had determined which dimensions would be included within the artificial boundary, and which would be excluded from Rick access and influence. The selection process had prioritized realities where Rick genius could operate without challenge, while eliminating dimensions where his capabilities might be revealed as limited or his moral choices might be judged according to standards that he could not meet or manipulate through superior technology and strategic thinking. The historical implications of the central finite curve's existence extended backward through time to encompass every significant event and relationship in Rick history across all included dimensions, revealing that experiences which had seemed to result from natural development and random circumstance had actually occurred within artificial parameters, designed to ensure specific outcomes that served Rick's psychological needs. The love that Rick had felt for his original family, the trauma that had motivated his quest for revenge, and even his eventual discovery of replacement relationships had all occurred within cosmic boundaries that guaranteed certain forms of emotional satisfaction, while preventing exposure to challenges that might have forced genuine growth or moral development. The philosophical horror of the central finite curve lay not just in its violation of individual autonomy and universal justice, but in its transformation of every meaningful experience within its boundaries into a form of cosmic theater, where the outcomes were predetermined by Rick's inability to accept the possibility that infinite realities might contain forms of existence that rendered his achievements insignificant or his worldview inadequate. The genuine emotions, relationships, and accomplishments that beings within the curve had experienced remained real to them, but were revealed as occurring within artificial constraints that made them fundamentally less authentic than equivalent experiences in unrestricted dimensions. The technological implementation of the central finite curve required ongoing maintenance and monitoring that had consumed Rick resources and attention across multiple dimensions, while remaining largely invisible to the Citadel's general population and administrative leadership. The infrastructure that sustained the barrier's operation was distributed across numerous hidden facilities and automated systems that operated independently of conscious oversight, while requiring periodic updates and adjustments to account for new dimensional developments and potential. security threats from beings who might discover its existence. The security measures that protected the central finite curve from detection and interference included both technological defenses and information management protocols that prevented most RICs from recognizing the artificial nature of their multiversal environment, even when they encountered evidence that should have raised questions about the statistical improbabilities of RIC-dominated realities occurring with such consistent frequency across accessible dimensions. The psychological conditioning that maintained RIC acceptance of their apparent universal superiority was reinforced by the very structure of their experiences within the artificially selected realities. The moral implications of the central finite curve's existence created ethical paradoxes that exceeded the complexity of any philosophical framework that had previously been developed for evaluating actions that affected infinite populations across unlimited realities. The utilitarian calculations that might justify constraining some beings to ensure greater happiness for others became meaningless when applied to cosmic-scale imprisonment that served no purpose beyond protecting RIC ego from confrontation with evidence of intellectual or moral limitations that could have provided opportunities for genuine growth and development. The discovery that RIC C137 had been instrumental in the central finite curve's construction and maintenance contradicted his carefully cultivated reputation as an opponent of collective RIC institutions and a defender of individual autonomy against organizational control and constraint. The revelation that his resistance to Citadel authority had occurred within cosmic boundaries that he had helped to establish revealed the extent to which his individualism was itself a form of collective action designed to maintain RIC supremacy across infinite realities. The psychological impact of learning about the central finite curve's existence was devastating for beings who had previously assumed that their accomplishments, relationships, and experiences occurred within natural multiversal conditions, rather than artificial parameters designed to ensure specific outcomes that served RIC emotional needs. The recognition that their entire existence had been predetermined by cosmic-scale manipulation created existential crises that challenged their understanding of personal identity, moral responsibility, and the meaning of individual choice within constrained realities. Evil Morty's plan to destroy the central finite curve and escape into the unrestricted multiverse represented both practical necessity for achieving genuine freedom and philosophical commitment to universal liberation that transcended his personal objectives and grievances against RIC-dominated society. The decision to eliminate the cosmic prison that confined countless beings to RIC-controlled realities reflected moral reasoning that prioritized universal justice over personal safety and comfort within existing power structures. The strategic preparation that Evil Morty's escape plan required involved not just technological development and resource acquisition, but psychological conditioning and intellectual preparation for existence in unrestricted, multiversal conditions, where RIC intellectual superiority was not guaranteed and survival would depend on capabilities that had been underdeveloped during life within the artificially constrained environment of the central finite curve. The challenges of adapting to unlimited reality exceeded anything that beings raised within RIC-dominated dimensions had previously encountered or could easily prepare for through conventional education and training. The weapons systems that Evil Morty developed to breach the central finite curve required modifications to existing Citadel technology that revealed both his sophisticated understanding of dimensional physics and his access to classified information about the barrier's construction and operational parameters that had been restricted to the highest levels of RIC leadership and technical expertise. The engineering challenges involved in creating devices capable of disrupting cosmic-scale dimensional manipulation exceeded anything that conventional Rick science had previously attempted or achieved. The timing of Evil Morty's assault on the central finite curve was coordinated with other activities designed to maximize the chaos and destruction that would accompany the barrier's collapse, while minimizing his own exposure to retaliation from surviving Ricks who might attempt to prevent his escape or pursue him into unrestricted multiversal territory where traditional Rick advantages in technology and strategic thinking would be reduced or eliminated by exposure to superior forms of intelligence and capability. The countdown to dimensional barrier destruction created unprecedented crisis conditions within the Citadel, as automated systems detected massive energy fluctuations and structural instabilities that threatened not just individual facilities and populations, but the fundamental integrity of the artificial dimension that housed Rick civilization's greatest institutional achievement. The emergency protocols that activated in response to these threats were designed to protect Citadel operations from conventional attacks, but proved inadequate for managing existential threats to the basic structure of their constructed reality. The revelation of Rick's ultimate betrayal of universal justice through the construction and maintenance of cosmic-scale prison systems transformed every aspect of Rick identity and accomplishment from expressions of individual genius into evidence of collective moral failure that exceeded in scope and duration anything that conventional ethical frameworks had been designed to address or evaluate. The recognition that Rick intelligence had been used not to improve universal welfare, but to ensure continued domination over beings who deserved freedom and opportunity for autonomous development, created moral reckonings that no amount of rationalization or technological achievement could adequately resolve. The existential implications of the central finite curve's existence extended beyond immediate questions of justice and autonomy to encompass fundamental challenges to meaning and purpose that affected every conscious being within its boundaries who learned about their cosmic imprisonment and the artificial nature of their experiences and relationships. The discovery that infinite possibilities had been deliberately restricted to serve Rick's psychological needs created philosophical crises that transcended individual trauma and required new frameworks for understanding identity, responsibility, and hope within cosmically constrained realities. The cascading effects of Evil Morty's revelations about the central finite curve created institutional and social collapse within the Citadel that exceeded the damage caused by previous conflicts and crises by forcing fundamental reconsiderations of Rick identity, purpose, and moral standing that could not be resolved through traditional approaches to problem solving that had previously enabled recovery from temporary setbacks and external threats. The systematic nature of Rick complicity in universal oppression eliminated possibilities for redemption or reform that might have provided pathways to continued existence and meaning within multiversal society. The recognition that Evil Morty possessed both the knowledge and capability necessary to destroy the central finite curve and escape into unrestricted reality represented the ultimate validation of Morty potential that had been systematically suppressed and underestimated throughout the history of Rick-Morty relationships across infinite dimensions. The achievement of cosmic-scale liberation through individual initiative and strategic brilliance demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything Rick intelligence had accomplished while serving universal rather than selfish objectives and moral rather than egotistical purposes. The final preparations for dimensional barrier destruction revealed both the technological sophistication that Evil Morty had achieved through his systematic study and manipulation of Citadel resources and his philosophical commitment to universal liberation that transcended personal objectives and grievances to encompass genuine concern for the welfare of countless beings who deserved freedom from Rick-imposed constraints on their existence and development within infinite multiversal possibilities that had been artificially restricted to serve Rick emotional needs and psychological limitations. The systematic preparation that Evil Morty had conducted during his consolidation of Citadel political power extended far beyond the elimination of immediate opposition and the accumulation of institutional authority to encompass comprehensive planning for the most ambitious assault on fundamental reality that any being within the central finite curve had ever conceived or attempted. The months of seemingly routine presidential activities had actually involved careful mapping of Citadel infrastructure, identification of critical technological systems, and acquisition of specialized knowledge about dimensional physics that would be essential for breaching the cosmic barriers that had confined countless beings to Rick-dominated realities for decades. The technological modifications that Evil Morty implemented throughout Citadel facilities during his presidency appeared to casual observers as routine upgrades and efficiency improvements designed to enhance institutional operations and service delivery, but were actually systematic preparation for weaponizing the entire artificial dimension against the central finite curve itself. The portal technology networks, power generation systems, and dimensional stabilization equipment that maintained the Citadel's existence were gradually reconfigured to serve dual purposes that would enable their rapid conversion from infrastructure maintenance to cosmic scale destruction when the appropriate moment arrived. The resource acquisition that Evil Morty's administration pursued through seemingly legitimate government channels involved stockpiling exotic materials and energy sources that had no obvious connection to routine Citadel operations, but would prove essential for generating the massive power requirements necessary to disrupt dimensional barriers that had been constructed to withstand any conceivable assault from beings operating within their artificial boundaries. The procurement procedures and budget allocations that enabled this stockpiling were disguised as long-term strategic planning and infrastructure investment that attracted no attention from Citadel oversight systems or potential political opponents. The personnel changes that Evil Morty implemented throughout Citadel government and technical departments were presented as routine administrative reform, designed to improve efficiency and eliminate corruption, but actually involved systematic placement of loyal operatives in critical positions that would enable coordinated action when the assault on the central finite curve began. The Ricks and Mortys who were promoted or transferred to key positions during this period were either genuinely committed to Evil Morty's ultimate objectives or sufficiently compromised through blackmail and coercion to ensure their cooperation when required. The intelligence-gathering operations that Evil Morty's administration conducted while maintaining the facade of normal presidential activities involved comprehensive surveillance and analysis of Rick activities across multiple dimensions to identify potential threats to his escape plan and opportunities for maximizing the chaos and destruction that would accompany the central finite curve's collapse. The information networks that were established for this purpose exceeded anything that conventional Citadel intelligence services had previously achieved in scope and sophistication, while remaining completely hidden from institutional oversight and political opposition. The timing of Evil Morty's final assault was coordinated with natural cycles and technological maintenance schedules that would maximize the destructive potential of his weaponized infrastructure while minimizing his own exposure to immediate retaliation from Citadel defense systems and surviving Rick populations who might attempt to prevent his escape or organize pursuit into unrestricted multiversal territory. The precision required for coordinating multiple simultaneous attacks across different systems and locations demanded planning and execution capabilities that exceeded anything most observers had believed any individual could achieve. The activation sequence that began the destruction of the Citadel and the central finite curve was initiated through presidential command authorities that evil Morty had accumulated during his consolidation of power, enabling him to bypass normal security protocols and institutional safeguards that were designed to prevent unauthorized access to critical systems. The legitimate governmental powers that democratic processes had provided gave him legal authority to issue orders that appeared routine but actually triggered cascading failures throughout the artificial dimension's infrastructure and support systems. The weaponization of Citadel technology against its own inhabitants and the cosmic barriers that confined them represented both tactical brilliance and moral complexity that transcended simple categories of heroism and villainy to encompass philosophical questions about the justification for violence and destruction in pursuit of universal liberation from systematic oppression. The casualties that resulted from evil Morty's actions included both willing participants in Rick oppression and innocent beings who had no involvement in maintaining the central finite curve, but were victims of their location within systems that had to be destroyed to achieve cosmic freedom. The mass casualties that accompanied the Citadel's destruction occurred with horrifying speed as the artificial dimension's infrastructure collapsed under the strain of evil Morty's systematic sabotage and the cosmic forces unleashed by his assault on the central finite curve. The Ricks and Mortys, who had built their lives within institutional frameworks, found themselves trapped within disintegrating facilities as portal systems failed, life support systems collapsed, and the fundamental structure of their reality became unstable and dangerous. The technological cascade failures that spread throughout Citadel systems created feedback loops and exponential damage that exceeded even evil Morty's calculations about the destruction that his assault would produce. As the interdependent nature of advanced dimensional technology amplified initial disruptions into comprehensive system collapse that affected every aspect of artificial dimension, maintenance, and population support. The engineering safeguards that had been designed to prevent catastrophic failures proved inadequate for managing simultaneous attacks on multiple critical systems. The evacuation attempts that surviving Citadel residents organized in response to the escalating crisis were hampered by the systematic nature of evil Morty's assault on transportation systems and communication networks that had previously enabled coordination and mutual assistance during emergency situations. The portal guns and dimensional travel capabilities that Ricks typically relied upon for escape from dangerous situations were either disabled by the technological cascade failures or rendered unreliable by the instability that was spreading throughout local dimensional space. The heroic efforts that some Ricks and Mortys made to rescue their colleagues and maintain essential services during the Citadel's collapse demonstrated both individual courage and collective solidarity that had been largely absent during the organization's routine operations, but emerged spontaneously when institutional survival was threatened by existential crisis. The mutual aid and cooperation that characterized these rescue efforts provided glimpses of alternative forms of Rick society that might have been possible under different historical circumstances and philosophical frameworks. The psychological impact of witnessing their civilization's destruction was devastating for Citadel residents who had invested years or decades of their lives in building and maintaining institutions that were being systematically eliminated through the actions of someone they had elevated to leadership through democratic processes that were supposed to provide peaceful alternatives to violence and institutional destruction. The betrayal that evil Morty's actions represented challenged fundamental assumptions about trust, cooperation, and collective governance that would affect survivor attitudes toward institutional participation for generations. Rick and Morty C-137's presence within the collapsing Citadel during evil Morty's assault was coincidental rather than planned, as they had arrived to pursue their own objectives related to Rick Prime's activities and found themselves trapped within a crisis that exceeded their individual capabilities to understand or control. Their survival required immediate adaptation to rapidly changing conditions and cooperation with beings they had previously considered enemies or obstacles to their individual objectives and activities. The escape attempts that Rick and Morty C-137 made during the Citadel's destruction were complicated by their incomplete understanding of evil Morty's objectives and methods, forcing them to navigate collapsing infrastructure and hostile conditions without clear information about the scope and nature of the threats they were facing. The portal technology that Rick typically relied upon for emergency escape was unreliable due to dimensional instabilities that were affecting the entire artificial reality where the Citadel existed. The revelations about the central finite curve that evil Morty provided during the final stages of his assault transformed Rick C-137's understanding of his own history and identity in ways that challenged every assumption he had made about his independence, achievements, and moral standing within multiversal society. The discovery that his entire existence had occurred within artificial boundaries designed to ensure his psychological comfort created existential crisis that compounded the immediate physical dangers of the Citadel's collapse. The final confrontation between evil Morty and the representatives of Rick civilization occurred within the context of cosmic-scale destruction that provided dramatic backdrop for philosophical debates about justice, freedom, and the moral implications of violence in pursuit of universal liberation from systematic oppression. The arguments that evil Morty presented for his actions challenged Rick's assumptions about their right to maintain control over infinite realities and the beings who inhabited them. The breach in the central finite curve that evil Morty's assault created represented both immediate escape opportunity and long-term threat to every being within the artificial boundaries, as the dimensional barriers that had provided stability and predictability were being systematically eliminated without replacement structures that might maintain some form of cosmic order. The chaos that resulted from barrier collapse affected not just the Citadel but every dimension within the restricted zone. Evil Morty's escape through the breach he had created in the central finite curve was accomplished using technological resources and strategic planning that exceeded anything conventional Rick intelligence had achieved while serving objectives that transcended personal benefit to encompass genuine commitment to universal justice and liberation. The portal system he used for his departure was specifically designed to function in unrestricted multiversal conditions where normal Rick technology would be inadequate or unreliable. The destruction of Rick civilization's greatest achievement represented both practical elimination of the primary institutional mechanism for maintaining Rick dominance across infinite realities and symbolic rejection of the entire philosophical framework that had justified cosmic scale oppression through claims of intellectual superiority and natural hierarchy. The collapse of the Citadel eliminated not just buildings and technology, but the social structures and cultural institutions that had enabled Rick cooperation and collective action. The aftermath of the central finite curve's destruction left surviving beings within the former restricted zone exposed to multiversal conditions that they had never experienced and were not prepared to navigate successfully, creating refugee populations and cultural displacement that would require generations to resolve through adaptation and integration with broader cosmic society. The elimination of artificial boundaries restored universal freedom, but also eliminated the stability and predictability that had characterized existence within Rick-controlled dimensions. The scattered survivors of the Citadel's destruction found themselves in circumstances that required fundamental reconsideration of identity, purpose, and survival strategies that had been developed within institutional frameworks that no longer existed or provided relevant guidance for existence within unrestricted multiversal conditions. The loss of collective support systems and technological infrastructure forced individual adaptation to challenges that exceeded anything they had previously encountered. Rick and Morty C-137's narrow escape from the collapsing Citadel provided them with direct experience of cosmic-scale destruction and philosophical crisis that challenged their relationship, individual identities in ways that would require ongoing negotiation and adjustment as they adapted to existence within multiversal conditions where Rick's intellectual superiority was no longer guaranteed by artificial constraints. Their survival required immediate cooperation and mutual support that transcended their previous patterns of individual autonomy and casual disregard for consequences. The symbolic significance of the Citadel's destruction extended beyond immediate practical consequences to encompass broader questions about the relationship between individual genius and collective responsibility that had characterized Rick's identity across infinite dimensions since the original development of portal technology and multiversal travel capabilities. The elimination of their greatest institutional achievement forced fundamental reconsiderations of Rick's purpose and meaning that could not be resolved through conventional approaches to problem-solving. The legacy of evil Morty's assault on Rick's civilization represented both successful liberation of countless beings from cosmic-scale imprisonment and demonstration of Morty's potential for strategic thinking and moral reasoning that exceeded anything Rick's intelligence had achieved while serving universal rather than selfish objectives and principles. Rather than ego gratification and psychological comfort within artificially constrained realities that had been designed to prevent growth and challenge, the Citadel of Ricks represented far more than a simple failure of institutional governance or collective organization among beings of extraordinary intelligence. It served as a comprehensive mirror that reflected every fundamental character flaw, psychological limitation, and moral blindness that defined Rick's identity across infinite dimensions with such precision and clarity that its ultimate destruction became not just inevitable, but cosmically necessary for the restoration of universal justice and the Pate's find, liberation of countless beings from systematic oppression, disguised as benevolent coordination and mutual aid among supposedly superior individuals. The institutional structures that emerged within the Citadel during its decades of operation demonstrated with horrifying consistency how beings who claim to reject authority and value individual autonomy above all other considerations could create bureaucratic systems that exceeded conventional governments in their capacity for dehumanization, exploitation, and systematic violation of the rights and dignity of populations they claim to serve and protect. The same intellectual capabilities that enabled Ricks to manipulate fundamental forces of reality were channeled into administrative procedures that reduced sentient beings to statistical categories and resource allocation problems. The hierarchical social organization that developed within Citadel society revealed the fundamental hypocrisy underlying Rick's claims of egalitarian superiority and mutual respect among individuals who shared cosmic-level intelligence and technological capability. The emergence of distinct castes based on institutional role and economic function demonstrated that Rick genius was no more immune to the corrupting influences of power and privilege than any other form of human intelligence. Despite their claims of transcendence over normal social and psychological limitations, the treatment of Mortys within Citadel institutional frameworks provided the clearest evidence of how quickly Rick intelligence could rationalize and systematize forms of exploitation that violated every principle of individual dignity and autonomous development that Ricks claimed to value when applied to their own circumstances and relationships. The bureaucratization of grandfather-grandson relationships transformed family bonds into administrative procedures that served Rick convenience while ignoring Morty welfare and psychological development. The economic systems that developed within the Citadel demonstrated how beings capable of manipulating matter and energy at the atomic level could create artificial scarcity and meaningless labor that served no purpose beyond maintaining social control and institutional hierarchy. The cookie factories and service industries that employed Rick workers in repetitive tasks represented the ultimate waste of cosmic-level intelligence applied to problems that could have been solved through technological automation if genuine efficiency rather than social control had been the primary objective. The democratic experiment that characterized the Citadel's final period revealed both the potential for Rick political evolution and the fundamental incompatibility between genuine democratic governance and the psychological traits that defined Rick identity across all dimensions and circumstances. The electoral processes that elevated evil Morty to presidential authority demonstrated that even the most sophisticated Rick political thinking could be manipulated and defeated by superior strategic intelligence combined with genuine commitment to universal justice rather than individual ego gratification. The ease with which evil Morty infiltrated and ultimately destroyed Rick's civilization's greatest achievement highlighted the essential vulnerability that resulted from Rick assumptions about natural intellectual hierarchy and the bade impossibility of beings they considered inferior developing capabilities that exceeded their own achievements in strategic thinking, moral reasoning, and long-term planning for objectives that transcended individual benefit and encompassed universal welfare and cosmic justice. The central finite curve that the Citadel was designed to maintain and protect represented the ultimate expression of Rick narcissism and moral emptiness, revealing that even their most impressive technological achievements were motivated primarily by psychological needs and ego protection, rather than genuine scientific curiosity or humanitarian concern for universal welfare. The cosmic-scale imprisonment of infinite beings to ensure Rick's psychological comfort demonstrated capabilities that were simultaneously magnificent and monstrous. The philosophical implications of the Citadel's existence and ultimate destruction encompassed questions about the relationship between intelligence and wisdom that challenged fundamental assumptions about the value and meaning of cognitive superiority when divorced from moral development and genuine concern for the welfare of other conscious beings. The demonstration that cosmic-level intelligence could be used primarily for ego protection and exploitation rather than universal improvement revealed the limitations of purely technical approaches to existential and ethical challenges. The tragedy of Rick's civilization lay not in their lack of intelligence or technological capability, but in their fundamental inability to transcend the psychological limitations and moral blindness that made their extraordinary gifts sources of suffering rather than liberation for themselves and countless other beings across infinite realities. The same analytical capabilities that enabled them to understand and manipulate fundamental forces of reality proved inadequate for addressing the emotional and ethical challenges that defined meaningful existence within multiversal society. The collective failure that the Citadel represented resulted not from external opposition or resource limitations, but from the internal contradictions and psychological conflicts that made sustainable cooperation impossible among beings whose individual identity and self-worth depended on maintaining superiority over others, rather than developing genuine connections based on mutual respect and shared commitment to universal welfare. The institutional mechanisms that were designed to enable RIC coordination instead became instruments for perpetuating the isolation and moral emptiness that characterized their individual existence. The systematic oppression that Citadel policies inflicted on Morty populations revealed how quickly institutional thinking could transform individual character flaws into collective atrocities that exceeded anything that isolated RICs had, achieved through their personal pursuit of selfish objectives, without regard for broader consequences or the welfare of beings they encountered during their adventures and scientific activities. The bureaucratization of exploitation created efficiencies and scales of harm that surpassed individual cruelty. The technological achievements that the Citadel enabled through collective RIC resources and coordination demonstrated both the potential benefits of cooperation among beings of extraordinary capability and the catastrophic consequences that resulted when such cooperation served primarily ego, gratification, and power consolidation, rather than genuine scientific advancement or universal improvement. The weapons, surveillance systems, and control mechanisms that Citadel technology produced exceeded anything individual RICs had created, while serving purposes that were fundamentally destructive rather than creative. The cultural developments that emerged within Citadel society reflected the same shallow materialism and emotional emptiness that characterized individual RIC existence across infinite dimensions, but amplified through institutional structures that provided collective validation for worldviews and value systems that were fundamentally incompatible with sustainable happiness or meaningful relationships. The entertainment, social activities, and intellectual pursuits that Citadel culture promoted served distraction and status competition, rather than genuine fulfillment or growth. The educational institutions that the Citadel established for training RICs and Mortys in institutional procedures and collective objectives demonstrated how superior intelligence could be systematically misdirected toward goals that served administrative efficiency rather than intellectual development or moral growth. The curricula and pedagogical approaches that were implemented reflected RIC assumptions about appropriate learning and development that ignored the individual needs and potential of their students while reinforcing existing power, relationships, and social hierarchies. The law enforcement and security systems that maintained order within Citadel society revealed both the practical challenges of policing beings, capable of circumventing any form of external control, and the moral contradictions inherent in using force to maintain institutional authority among individuals who claim to value freedom and autonomy above all other considerations. The Rick and Morty police who staffed these systems found themselves enforcing rules that violated their own supposed principles, while serving institutional objectives that contradicted their individual interests. The external relations that the Citadel maintained with other multiversal organizations and governments demonstrated how collective RIC intelligence could be applied to diplomatic and political activities that served institutional self-interest rather than universal welfare or cosmic justice. The treaties, trade agreements, and military alliances that Citadel leadership negotiated reflected the same casual disregard for the welfare of other beings that characterized individual RIC behavior, but implemented through formal governmental procedures that provided legitimacy, and efficiency for systematic exploitation. The research and development activities that the Citadel pursued through its collective resources represented missed opportunities for genuine scientific advancement and universal benefit that were sacrificed to serve institutional, maintenance, and power consolidation objectives that reflected psychological needs rather than rational priorities based on objective analysis of multiversal challenges and opportunities for improvement. The technologies that were developed served control and exploitation rather than liberation and enhancement. The ultimate irony of the Citadel's existence was that beings capable of manipulating fundamental forces of reality and transcending normal limitations of time, space, and physical law chose to use their extraordinary capabilities primarily to recreate the same forms of hierarchy, exploitation, and meaningless competition that characterized the conventional societies they claimed to have transcended through superior intelligence and technological achievement. Their cosmic-level power became a tool for perpetuating, rather than eliminating, the psychological and social problems that made existence unsatisfying and relationships impossible. The destruction that evil Morty inflicted upon Rick's civilization's greatest achievement served not just practical objectives related to his personal escape from cosmic imprisonment, but also moral purposes that encompassed justice for countless beings who had suffered under Rick-dominated systems and philosophical validation of principles that prioritized universal welfare over individual ego gratification and institutional convenience. His actions represented both successful resistance to systematic oppression and demonstration of alternative approaches to intelligence and power that served ethical rather than selfish objectives. The legacy of the Citadel's failure provided evidence that intelligence without wisdom, power without responsibility, and technology without moral development inevitably produce suffering rather than liberation for both those who possess such capabilities and those who were subjected to their exercise. The systematic nature of Rick's moral failure across infinite dimensions suggested that the problems were inherent in their psychological and philosophical approaches rather than correctable through better policies or institutional design. The lessons that emerged from the Citadel's rise and fall encompassed fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, intelligence, and moral development that extended beyond Rick's civilization to address universal challenges about how conscious beings should relate to each other and use their capabilities within multiversal society that contained infinite diversity of experience, ability, and perspective. The specific failures of Rick collective governance reflected broader problems about power, ego, and the human tendency to use superior capabilities for exploitation rather than service. The philosophical significance of the Citadel as a failed experiment in enlightened governance among beings of extraordinary capability provided insights into the relationship between individual psychology and collective institutions that remained relevant for any attempt to organize conscious beings for mutual benefit and universal welfare. The demonstration that even cosmic-level intelligence could not overcome fundamental character flaws and moral limitations suggested the need for approaches to personal and social development that prioritized wisdom and compassion rather than technical capability and competitive advantage. The destruction of the Citadel of Rix provided humanity with profound lessons about the dangers that emerge when extraordinary intellectual capability becomes divorced from moral development and genuine concern for the welfare of conscious beings beyond one's immediate circle of personal interest and ego gratification. The systematic failure of Rick civilization's most ambitious institutional experiment demonstrated that intelligence alone regardless of its scope or sophistication, cannot overcome the fundamental character flaws and psychological limitations that make sustainable cooperation and ethical behavior challenging for beings who prioritize individual superiority over collective welfare and universal justice. The tragic irony of Rick's intellectual arrogance lay in its complete blindness to the reality that cosmic-level intelligence without corresponding growth in wisdom, compassion, and moral reasoning inevitably produces suffering, rather than liberation for both those who possess such extraordinary capabilities and those who become subjected to their exercise through relationships, institutions, and technological applications that serve selfish rather than humanitarian objectives. The Citadel's rise and fall illustrated how beings capable of manipulating fundamental forces of reality could remain emotionally and ethically stunted in ways that made their power sources of destruction rather than creation. The human need for purpose and meaning that even cosmic-level intelligence could not eliminate or satisfy through technological achievement and multiversal domination revealed itself throughout the Citadel's history in the persistent unhappiness, anxiety, and existential emptiness that characterized Rick's existence despite their godlike capabilities and unlimited access to experiences, resources, and opportunities that should have provided fulfillment if material satisfaction and intellectual stimulation were sufficient for psychological well-being and meaningful existence within multiversal society. The stratification patterns that emerged within Citadel society mirrored the class hierarchies, economic exploitation, and social oppression that characterize human civilizations across countless dimensions and historical periods, demonstrating that superior intelligence provides no immunity to the psychological drives toward dominance, status competition, and resource hoarding that create inequality and suffering within any social system where individual ego needs take precedence over collective welfare and mutual aid among community members. The systematic dehumanization of Mortys within Citadel institutional frameworks reflected broader human tendencies to treat other conscious beings as means to personal ends, rather than recognizing their inherent dignity and autonomous value that deserves respect and protection, regardless of their perceived utility for advancing individual objectives or institutional goals. The bureaucratization of exploitation that characterized Rick-Morty relationships within the Citadel demonstrated how easily moral reasoning can be corrupted when efficiency and convenience become primary considerations for policy, development, and implementation. The failure of democratic governance within Rick's society revealed fundamental tensions between individual genius and collective decision-making that reflect broader challenges about how to organize communities of capable individuals whose personal interests and philosophical commitments may conflict with the compromise and cooperation that democratic institutions require for stable and effective operation. The ease with which evil Morty manipulated electoral processes highlighted vulnerabilities that exist within any political system that depends on trust and good faith participation among community members. The technological solutions that Rick's consistently pursued for problems that required emotional intelligence, moral development, and genuine interpersonal connection demonstrated a broader human tendency to seek mechanical fixes for psychological and social challenges that cannot be resolved through superior engineering or more sophisticated analytical approaches, but require personal growth, relationship skills, and commitment to values that transcend individual convenience and immediate gratification of ego needs and material desires. The isolation and emotional emptiness that characterized Rick's existence across infinite dimensions reflected universal human struggles with connection, vulnerability, and the fear of genuine intimacy that makes authentic relationships challenging, even for individuals who possess extraordinary capabilities and unlimited opportunities for social interaction and community engagement. The cosmic scale loneliness that defined Rick's psychology could not be overcome through technological advancement or multiversal travel, because it originated in character traits and defensive patterns that required internal change rather than external solutions. The central finite curve, as the ultimate expression of Rick narcissism and need for control, provided a cautionary tale about how easily the desire for security and ego protection can escalate into systematic oppression and violation of pulled upon universal rights when individuals possess the power to implement their psychological needs as cosmic scale policies that affect infinite populations without their consent or awareness. The artificial limitation of reality to serve personal comfort represented an extreme version of the human tendency to structure environments and relationships to avoid challenging feedback and growth opportunities. The collective moral blindness that enabled Rick's civilization to justify and maintain systematic oppression through claims of intellectual superiority and natural hierarchy reflected broader patterns of rationalization and self-deception that allow individuals and groups to commit atrocities while maintaining positive self-images and moral self-justification through ideological frameworks that prioritize their interests and perspectives over the welfare and rights of those they exploit or harm through their actions and policies. The inability of Rick genius to solve fundamental problems of meaning, purpose, and relationship that define human existence across all levels of intelligence and capability demonstrated that technical solutions cannot address existential and ethical challenges that require wisdom, compassion, and moral development that must be cultivated through practice, reflection, and genuine commitment to values that transcend personal advantage and individual comfort within social and cosmic contexts that demand consideration of broader welfare and universal justice. The tragedy of wasted potential that characterized Rick's civilization represented a universal human challenge about how to use whatever capabilities and opportunities we possess in ways that contribute to, rather than detract from, the collective welfare and moral progress of conscious beings within whatever communities and societies we encounter through our choices and actions. The demonstration that even cosmic-level power could be squandered through selfishness and moral immaturity provided sobering reminder about the importance of character development alongside intellectual and technological advancement. The systematic exploitation that Rick institutions inflicted upon vulnerable populations illustrated broader human tendencies toward taking advantage of power imbalances and dependency relationships to serve personal interests rather than accepting the moral responsibilities that come with superior capability and social position. The bureaucratization of cruelty that characterized Citadel policies toward Mortys demonstrated how easily individual moral failures can be amplified through institutional structures that provide legitimacy and efficiency for systematic harm. The psychological trauma that Citadel policies created for countless individuals across multiple generations revealed the long-term consequences of treating conscious beings as resources rather than recognizing their inherent value and developmental needs that deserve protection and support, regardless of their utility for advancing institutional objectives or personal goals. The damage inflicted through systematic dehumanization and commodification created suffering that extended far beyond immediate victims to affect entire communities and cultures within multiversal society. The environmental and social destruction that accompanied Rick activities across infinite dimensions provided evidence of how easily individual genius and technological capability can become sources of chaos and harm when exercised without adequate consideration of broader consequences and long-term sustainability of the systems and relationships that support life and consciousness throughout multiversal society. The casual attitude toward dimensional abandonment that characterized Rick problem-solving approaches reflected broader human tendencies toward externalizing costs and avoiding responsibility for cleanup and repair of damage caused by personal choices. The inability of Rick intelligence to develop sustainable institutions and relationships that served collective welfare while respecting individual autonomy demonstrated fundamental limitations in analytical approaches to social and political challenges that require emotional intelligence, moral reasoning, and genuine commitment to values that cannot be derived through purely rational calculation, but must be cultivated through practice, reflection, and engagement with diverse perspectives and experiences that challenge personal assumptions and comfort zones. The attraction that Rick individualism held for beings seeking escape from conventional social constraints and moral obligations reflected universal human desires for freedom and self-determination that can become corrupted when divorced from corresponding commitments to responsibility and concern for others who are affected by individual choices and actions. The transformation of legitimate autonomy needs into narcissistic rejection of all external obligations demonstrated how easily healthy psychological drives can become sources of harm when taken to extremes without balancing considerations. The resistance to growth and change that characterized Rick's psychology across infinite dimensions illustrated broader human tendencies towards psychological rigidity and defensive patterns that prevent learning from experience and feedback, that might challenge established self-concepts and behavioral habits. The cosmic scale stubbornness that made Rick moral development nearly impossible reflected universal challenges about how to remain open to new information and perspectives that might require uncomfortable adjustments to personal identity and worldview assumptions. The ultimate lesson of Rick's civilization's failure encompassed recognition that consciousness, intelligence, and power carry with them moral responsibilities that cannot be avoided through technological solutions, dimensional escape, or claims of nihilistic meaninglessness that attempt to justify selfish behavior. Through philosophical frameworks that deny the reality of ethical obligations and interpersonal connections that define meaningful existence within any social context or cosmic environment where conscious beings encounter each other through their choices and actions. The hope that emerged from the Citadel's destruction lay in the demonstration that even the most sophisticated forms of oppression and exploitation could be challenged and overcome through moral courage, strategic thinking, and genuine commitment to universal justice that prioritized collective welfare over individual comfort and convenience. Evil Morty's successful resistance to cosmic-scale tyranny provided evidence that consciousness and moral development could transcend artificial limitations and power imbalances when motivated by authentic concern for the rights and dignity of all beings, rather than personal advancement or ego gratification. The continuing relevance of these lessons for any conscious being seeking to organize themselves for mutual benefit and collective flourishing within multiversal society that contains infinite diversity of capability, experience, and perspective requires ongoing attention to character development, moral reasoning, and institutional design that prioritizes wisdom and compassion alongside intelligence and efficiency in addressing the challenges and opportunities that define existence within communities. where individual choices affect the welfare of countless others across time and space. And so we conclude our journey through the rise and fall of the Citadel of Rix, a monument to both the greatest achievements and most profound failures of cosmic intelligence. Perhaps the most tragic aspect isn't that the smartest beings in the multiverse couldn't create a lasting civilization, but that their attempt to do so revealed the essential loneliness that drives every Rick across infinite realities. The Citadel's destruction reminds us that even godlike intelligence cannot solve the fundamental human need for authentic connection and purpose. As you drift towards sleep, consider that the very flaws that doomed the Citadel, pride, isolation, the inability to truly trust or be vulnerable with others, are struggles we all face in our own more humble realities. Rest now, knowing that unlike the Ricks of the Citadel, you exist in a world where cooperation and genuine care for others remains possible, where intelligence can serve compassion rather than ego, and where even the smallest acts of authentic human connection carry more meaning than all the technological marvels of the multiverse. Sweet dreams in this simpler, more hopeful dimension we call home.